Hey friends, Elizabeth here, and the summer is gone. It's done, somehow. It's now September, we're in the fall. I am fully prepared to reach my final form. But also, August was a bit of a rough month for me in general, and also a rough reading month. You can check out my Read It or Unhaul It reading blog if you want more details, because I go into it there. But basically, lots of things happened. It was a difficult month, and I only read for 2 of the 4 weeks in August. So for that reason, didn't finish as many books as I normally do. I know 6 books in a month is still a lot. Don't worry, I'm not delusional, but I do know it's also less than my average. So keep that in mind. But I did still want to show up here and share my thoughts, reviews for you of all the books I finished in August, especially for those books that are not highlighted in another reading vlog, for example. So that's what we're going to do today. Also, this video is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform that I have personally been using for a decade. We'll talk about them a little later in this video, but let's just jump in with the first book I finished in August, which was our book club pick for my Patreon book club, The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. And The Sword of Kaigen is fantasy, but it does have a little bit of a sci-fi influence. It's a little more nebulous speculative fiction in that it takes place in a more modern setting and there is advanced technology. But for the most part, the way that it reads and comes across and the conventions that it pulls from genre-wise is definitely more fitting with fantasy. I read Blood Over Brighthaven and loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I read that for a reading vlog, so I'll link that reading vlog if you want to see my reaction the first time I read anything by this author. And I was really excited to read The Sword of Kaigen. And when I did that reading vlog, a lot of comments were telling me that I needed to read this book as well and just read more M.L. Wang, which I was very excited to do. Unfortunately, I didn't hate it. Okay, don't get worried. I didn't hate The Sword of Kaigen, but I didn't love it. And I didn't love it nearly as much as I loved Blood Over Brighthaven. I've really wrestled with my feelings on this one, and I went back and forth a lot in our book club discussion on this one because I just had so many mixed feelings. And I'll try to distill them down and be a little bit more concise because I think our discussion was approaching 3 hours. So I'll not do that to you, but I wanted to love this so badly. I wanted this to be another 5-star read. I wanted to love it as deeply as I did Blood Over Brighthaven, and that just didn't quite happen for me. I will say that the structure of this, the pacing of this is kind of off the wall. So much of this, and this is a pretty long novel. I read it in ebook form, and I think it was approaching 600 pages. I'm not sure how many pages it would be in a physical form. The vast majority of this book is a battle, a single battle. And I'm not the biggest fan of battle scenes in my books in general. I don't necessarily mind them if they really serve the narrative, if they feed into the character development and the themes, and it feels well earned. And usually part of my sort of caveat there is that I don't mind fight scenes as long as they don't go on for too long, because it's just not my favorite thing to read. And this was possibly the longest fight scene I've ever read in my life. And I wouldn't say that it was poorly written necessarily. I was pretty invested in it as it was happening, but I did also keep pausing and checking what page I was on and feeling completely baffled and mystified that the battle was still happening. But like I said, I am not the biggest fan of battles in general, so I will put that caveat out there. Something that I did really like and that is different from a lot of fantasy I've read, you get quite a bit of detail into the aftermath of the battle instead of the battle finishing and that being the end of the book, or it finishes and you quickly fast forward past all the rebuilding and healing from the trauma to things being basically back to normal. In this book, we get the battle drawn out for a lot of the book, and then the whole end of the book is the aftermath and the immediate aftermath and the trauma and the destruction and an attempt at starting to rebuild. So that's kind of interesting, and I did like that choice because I think that's something that's often ignored in a lot of books that have big battle scenes. They kind of skim over what kind of repercussions come with that level of destruction and death. I think it was well written, it was engaging, it was exciting. Even though it started pretty early in the book, I was already relatively invested in the characters, at least in our 2 protagonists. So I did care about how things were going to turn out and whether they were going to make it through the battle. And I was also invested in quite a few of the secondary characters. So it did feel like it had stakes and weight. It's just not my personal favorite thing ever to read such a long battle scene. Another interesting thing that the Sword of Kaigen does is that it's two protagonists. We have a young boy who is studying to develop his magic skills and become a fighter, and his mother, who was actually quite a skilled magician fighter and gave that up to get married and have children in this very patriarchal sort of traditional society where she's meant to fulfill all these very gendered traditional roles and leave her past behind. Mamoru is a teenager, and the beginning of the book, the way the book starts, makes it feel like it's a children's book. And I found that quite jarring starting it because I was under the impression it was adult fantasy. But I will say that while I preferred Misaki as a protagonist generally, and I liked the perspective of an older character, a mother, we spend a not insignificant amount of time flashing back to Misaki's childhood when she was fighting. And I must say, I did not care for those flashbacks at all. I just literally didn't care. I liked Misaki as a character. I found her interesting, and I found her journey interesting. And obviously, well, if you've read the book, then you know, obviously, that her past as a fighter is very important to her story and her journey in the novel that we are reading in the current moment. But I don't feel that we necessarily needed the flashbacks to be able to understand that side of her. And I honestly think it would have been very cool if we learned that about her in the moment during the battle and not in flashbacks before that point. It would have been a fun reveal for us, just as it was a reveal for some of the other characters that she was so skilled. But the flashbacks, I just didn't feel connected to. I feel they went on for too long. I wasn't attached to the other characters that were introduced as part of the flashbacks, and it just felt like they were sort of pulling away from the main story and a little repetitive and a little like it was sidetracking the actual narrative and making the pacing feel a little bit more stilted. In general, I will say that the first half of the novel, or the first third maybe of the novel, felt quite repetitive and also had so much info dumping. It was kind of ridiculous. It used the structure of, we are in a classroom learning about history, so my teacher's now going to give us a lecture about history so that you, the reader, now learn all of this world building, which is not my favorite. We also have another teenage kid who's new to the school meeting Mamoru and just telling him, hey, things you thought you knew about the world aren't right, here's the actual reality, and then also just spewing all this knowledge about the world to him. It's not my favorite method of world building. The beginning with all the info dumping and focusing on this younger protagonist and the writing style being a little bit more repetitive and simplistic, I was feeling quite disconnected, and especially when we start meeting Misaki, I was more interested in her as a character, I was more intrigued by her, but we spent a lot of the first part of the novel in those flashbacks, which I also was not particularly interested in or engaged by. They felt very YA fantasy coded along with Mamoru at the beginning. But I will say that as the novel progressed, especially as we get into the lead up to the battle and the battle itself, Mamoru grew on me a lot as a character, and I ended up really loving him as a character and as one of our two protagonists, as much as he definitely is young, and the way that it was framed at the start of him being sort of the chosen one and the most talented of all the kids, and he's at a magic school and all of that stuff that I felt was a bit uninspired. But I did feel like the characterization in this novel, with the exception of one character and their arc, was really well done, and especially for Mamoru and Misaki. Incredible character development. I was very attached to them, very emotionally invested in them. I normally don't do spoiler sections in my wrap-ups, but I feel I have to talk about a couple things about this novel that didn't work for me that are in the second half, and I feel like even trying to allude to them would kind of be a spoiler. So I'm going to do a spoiler section, but first I just want to say that I felt like this had some contradictions. It was internally inconsistent at times. It was a bit jumbled and messy at times. The first half felt like it relied too much on YA tropes and conventions and info dumping, and the second half felt better overall, but had some rushed and sort of unbelievable character development and a plot line that I felt was a bit poorly handled considering the severity of the subject matter for a secondary character, which I'll talk about in the spoiler section. I was interested in the themes that it was examining to do with propaganda and also traditional gender roles and women's place in society, misogyny sort of built into the fabric of a family or a society or a culture. But I'm not sure that I felt that either one were explored quite to the depth that I personally prefer, though I do feel that the characters and the relationships, for the most part, were really beautifully drawn. And I think that that's maybe part of why so many people love this, either people who love battles and get a really long one here, and or people who are character-driven readers and grew to really love these characters, which I certainly did, and I was very emotionally invested in them. So spoilers for the Sword of Kaigen, just quickly so I can talk about those 2 points, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so the 2 things that I am struggling with, the 2 sort of characters and the way their stories were handled, that I felt in both cases, I guess, that they were kind of rushed and not given as much attention as I wish they were given. The first is Takeru, who is Mamoru's father and Misaki's husband. He is very cold and withdrawn and abusive. In the first part of the novel, he very much feels like the villain of the piece at the beginning, and could be argued to be the reason for Mamoru's death, which, again, spoilers right now, that Mamoru dies, even though he's one of the 2 protagonists, and that was absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. And Takeru is part of the reason why. Takeru is given a redemption arc for some reason, and it just felt not only unnecessary, I really didn't like him as a character and I didn't care for him to get a redemption arc, but also it happened so fast and it just felt very unrealistic. He and Misaki never really had a true partnership. They never had a true marriage. They never really talked to each other or connected at all emotionally. But then they have this they literally just fight each other and then have a conversation. And Takeru admits that he was abused by his father, which is not a shocker because he also abused Misaki when she joined the family, and Takeru didn't stop him from doing so. And that led him to be very withdrawn and to sort of cut himself off from his feelings, which is maybe a realistic thing to happen after abuse, but does not excuse the way that he treated Misaki and his children. But also, it does not make sense that someone who is now in his 40s, I believe, who was abused all through childhood and developed this coping mechanism of being completely cut off from his emotions, would be able to recognize it and verbalize it just because he had a duel with his wife, be able to articulate it, be able to be vulnerable with someone who he has basically no relationship with, to admit that, and then also to have so much growth and to suddenly be, he doesn't change completely overnight, but he changes pretty significantly. He becomes much more communicative and connected to his emotions and honest, and I think we're meant to see this as a huge growth for him, a turn in their relationship, that they're now going to have a real marriage and be really connected, and he's not going to shut her out anymore, and that just felt so unrealistic and so sudden and unearned for me. The second character arc that I really struggled with was Hiyori, who was one of Misaki's friends, a fellow mother in this village. And she is a secondary character. She is a much more minor character in the first part of the story. But during the battle, her husband is killed. And then her very young child, who I believe is an infant or a toddler, is killed. And then she is sexually assaulted. Her house is also destroyed, which is all incredibly traumatic. And then she falls pregnant and she doesn't know if it was her husband or this enemy combatant who assaulted her. And she's obviously going through a huge amount of pain and suffering, and the other characters are sort of vaguely aware of that and give her lip service of support, but they also build a shed in the backyard and tell her to go live there by herself and don't give her any extensive support past that point, as she is really struggling. And she eventually completes because of her shame and despair and depression and grief right after giving birth. And it seems that she also might have considered or been about to attempt to take her newborn baby with her. And I just feel that not only is that so heavy, which, books can explore heavy things, that's fine. I read a lot of books that explore heavy ideas. But I just feel that for what is essentially a tertiary character in this book, who gets very little page time and very little development, to explore these kinds of themes in a character who's barely on the page, and we get very little of her experience. It just felt very jarring. I felt like this kind of subject matter and how difficult it is was not given the amount of care and attention that I personally would prefer. If I'm going to have to read such painful, traumatic, difficult subject matter, I would hope that it's being explored with a lot of care and respect and intention and some complexity and nuance. And it's not that I felt that it was a spectacle or something. It just was so fast. It was surface level because the character was not a character that we got to know very well and was not really centered in the story. It just, to me, it felt unnecessary. And considering the subject matter, I just wished that it wasn't included in the book at all if it wasn't going to be given the amount of time and weight that it really deserved. It was very intense, and also the repercussions of that are not explored. But that's it for spoilers. I just wanted to touch on those two characters and the parts of their stories, mostly the ends of their stories, that didn't quite work for me and how they were executed. But I do think that some of the themes of becoming a parent and losing touch with what made you a person before you were a parent, and then that making you a worse parent because you have lost who you are, and being able to reconnect with who you are, with what you love, with your hobbies, with doing things for yourself, can allow you to be more fully yourself, more fully embodied, and therefore a better parent and better able to connect with your kids. I thought that was a really lovely message and through line of this novel. There were themes of sacrifice and family and duty that were all explored in interesting ways. And I just think that this had so much potential. It had some really interesting ideas. It had some incredibly vivid characters. It had some lovely pockets of writing, but I just felt that the execution was pretty uneven, and there were certain characters, certain plot lines, certain aspects of the story that I didn't feel were dealt with in as complex, nuanced, fully realized a way as I would hope for, and sort of what I expected coming from reading Blood Over Brighthaven. And I realized this was written earlier and it was indie published. Very mixed feelings, kind of all over the place. And I'm landing on 3 stars. And I would really love to hear your thoughts if you've read The Sword of Kaigen, especially if you've read both Blood Over Brighthaven and The Sword of Kaigen. What were your ratings of both of them? And do you agree or disagree with me on any of these points? I was very sad to not just wholeheartedly adore it, but it is what it is. Next up in August, I read The Labyrinth of the Spirits by Carlos Ruiz Zafon. This is book 4 in the Cemetery of Forgotten Books series that starts with The Shadow of the Wind. And I've been reading this series for a couple years now, and I finally finished it. Book 1, and also, actually, hang on, I just thought about it. I think every book in the series I read for a reading vlog. So you can actually go back and sort of experience it with me and hear my thoughts immediately after finishing, and also for quite a few of them as I'm reading them. So anyways, that's fun. I just realized that. But because I do have a reading vlog on this one, which I'll link down below, I'm not going to go into great detail because, like I said, I just talked for half an hour about the Sword of Kaigen without planning on it. But suffice to say, I really loved this. I give it 5 stars. It's not a perfect book. There are little quibbles I have here and there, which I talk about in my review in the reading vlog, but I really enjoyed this. I was very invested. I really loved the old characters, but also the new characters that were introduced in this book. I thought that the political social commentary was even more clear and incisive in this one than in some of the past books. And I felt that this was sort of rivaling The Angel's Game, which up to this point I had considered to be the darkest in the series. This one has some pretty intense and harrowing subject matter, and some subject matter that is inspired by real life events in the wake of the Spanish Civil War that Carlos Ruiz Zafon was trying to comment on. And I just thought that the way that this wrapped up the series, the way that it brought characters together from different parts of the series, and the way that it handled different storylines for the most part was really beautifully done. I thought the writing was gorgeous. It has an amazing sense of place. It was emotional and intense and really well paced, even though it's quite a long book. It's, what is it? Over 700 pages, but it did not feel that long. I just overall had a really awesome time with it. I really loved reading it. I loved this series in general, and I gave it 5 stars. I would recommend this series if you haven't read it yet. The Shadow of the Wind, the first book in the series, is fantastic as well, but definitely go check out the reading vlog for many more in-depth thoughts, including spoiler sections if you want those, but definitely had a very good time with this. Next in August, I had an arc from NetGalley for T. Kingfisher's new book, Snake Eater. I think this came out in August or maybe in July. This is described as horror, I believe, but I personally wouldn't classify it as horror. We are following our protagonist, Selena, who has shown up in this remote desert town to stay with her aunt after leaving her partner, and she's there with her dog. And things are not as they appear in this tiny little town on the edge of the desert. This one was not my favorite thing ever. There are things I liked about it, but again, kind of like The Sword of Kaigen, I had very wildly different reactions to different aspects of the story. I haven't really been able to figure out T. Kingfisher's style yet and how I relate to the style. I know that so many people absolutely adore T. Kingfisher's work, but I have read one of her novellas and it also was a 3-star read. And then I tried to read one of her other books and DNF'd early on. And I really don't DNF very often, but I just couldn't continue. It really wasn't working for me. And then this one, I did also almost DNF at the start, but I really pushed myself to keep going because I had an arc and I wanted to be able to review it. And I just really struggled for the first half, if not more, of this book. The writing style was so choppy and I couldn't understand why. Such short sentences, lots and lots and lots of very, very short sentences. And it was very blunt and lacking in dynamics and variety in the sentence structure and sort of a rhythm to it. It doesn't have to be extremely lyrical, but I do appreciate writing that you can tell the authors put thought into the rhythm, the flow of the words and the sentences themselves and the paragraphs. And it just felt like this was very punchy and repetitive in its structure, and it was driving me up the wall. I also felt like in the first third of this especially, we spent so much time derailing into completely unnecessary, intimate, tiny details about things that it just didn't care and were not relevant, while skipping over things that would have actually been really helpful to learn about and know. It wasn't until the second half of this, if not the ending really, that I realized that this was meant to be in the future. The world building was basically non-existent, but we kept getting details about teeny tiny things that, again, were just not relevant to the story or didn't feel like they should be relevant. I also wasn't fully on board with the main character at the beginning. She did eventually grow on me a bit more, but she just wasn't my favorite. I actually loved most of the characters in this book, except for the main character, who I found quite frustrating. She came across much younger than she was meant to be. The main character referred to her script, so she plans what she's going to say ahead of time. She has a script, a mental script for all kinds of situations. The word script in that context shows up 38 times, and this is a novella. The number of times that her internal monologue is, I didn't have a script for this situation, or I have the perfect script for this situation, was far too many. And the writing style, on top of being very choppy, clunky, lots of short bullet sentences and lots of repetition of the same words, went back and forth between third and first person, which I found kind of jarring and also felt repetitive because something would happen in first person and then we would be told the same thing again in third person after that for some reason. I will say that the setting was incredibly immersive. It takes place in the desert and you really feel, or at least I really felt like I was there, like I could see and smell and taste what it was like in that still heat of the desert. I thought that the direction the story went in was kind of interesting. A lot of the characters were endearing, the relationships were endearing. It was a bit of a found family kind of cozy fantasy horror dynamic. There are a lot of repeated words and phrases throughout that almost felt like they were placeholders to be edited later. So I don't know, maybe I'll try to find a final version to see if those were changed because it just felt excessive, the amount of specific word and phrase repetition. The setting was great. The sort of cozy horror fantasy aspect, the found family was fun. World building was basically non-existent and the writing style and the protagonist did not work for me at all. So very mixed. But yeah, that's Snake Eater. I really just continue to not know how I feel about T. Kingfisher and I keep wanting to try to read her books because so many of her premises sound really up my alley and interesting and people rave about her work so much, but then my few experiences with her work have been very mixed. So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Have you read T. Kingfisher's work? Do you have favorites? Do you have completely different feelings about these books than I do? Or do you agree with me? Do you think some of her other books might be more up my alley? Let me know your thoughts, because I keep trying and I keep failing to connect with her stuff. I think I'm landing at 3 stars for this one. 2.5 stars rounded up to 3. This video is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform that helps you make a beautiful and functional website quickly and easily, even if you have zero website building experience. I've been using Squarespace for my various websites for a decade now, so I am very familiar with how amazingly easy Squarespace is to use. Whether you decide to start with one of their many amazing design templates, which are designed by professionals and can fit so many different types of websites, or or you decide to try out their new design intelligence, which is a combination of decades of professional design experience and the power of AI technology to custom build the perfect website for you, Squarespace has you covered with design tools that are as intuitive and detailed as you need them to be. Whether you want Squarespace to help you out with their font duos or pre-built color palettes, or if you want to get into the nitty-gritty yourself and put in your specific hex code, choose exactly which fonts you want where, really get into all the details, Squarespace allows you to do that. They want you to be able to build the website of your dreams, no matter how detail-oriented or specific you want to get with it. And their drag and drop technology is so easy to use and very precise. Squarespace has so many built-in design tools and functionalities that you can implement into your website, including the ability to sell products, physical or digital, and take payments through your store. With just a few clicks, you can get started taking payments from your clients and customers while giving them more ways to pay. From Apple Pay, Klarna, ACH Direct Debit, Afterpay, and ClearPay, Squarespace wants to help you make more sales and help you track your sales on the back end. Squarespace makes it so easy to start and run an online store. You can even print your shipping labels directly through Squarespace to save time fulfilling orders. Squarespace really has options for everyone, no matter what your personal style is, no matter what your website is for, what industry you're in. Squarespace can help you build a website that is professional and true to you and your personality and your presence that you want to have on the internet. If you're ready to give Squarespace a try, head to squarespace.com for your free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride and use code plantbasedbride, or use this handy dandy QR code to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Next up in August, I read another book for my Read It or Unhaul It challenge, so I'll link that reading vlog down below for a much more detailed review. But that is The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. I adored this so much. I gave it 5 stars. Please go read this book. This is YA contemporary / near future dystopian, and it has a little bit of a sci-fi element and is written by a Canadian Indigenous author and includes themes of residential schools in Canada, which were forced boarding schools for Indigenous Canadians who were abused and also forced to assimilate into European white Christian beliefs, language, cultural practices in what is considered now to be a cultural genocide. And this is sort of an imagining of how the residential school system could be brought back in another way if it became beneficial to the government and the rest of the population of Canada to do so, and imagines a situation in which that would be the case. And this was just a beautiful book. It was so beautifully written. This is my second book by this author, and I have loved both of them, although this is definitely my favorite. The characters are so vivid. You really fall in love with them. You get so attached to them. There were several moments that made me sob reading this. The writing is not overly flowery or complex. It is aimed at younger YA, maybe 12 to 15-ish, maybe more like 14 to 16, but definitely teenagers. But the writing is still beautiful and very evocative. You get such a strong sense of place for the Canadian wilderness, really great character and relationship building, great pacing, quite tense and intense, very emotional and harrowing, and explores its themes with so much complexity and care and insight. It was really gorgeous. I have such strong feelings about this book and about these characters. I know I will be rereading this one in my life, although I do need some time to recover emotionally before I do that to myself again. But this was really beautiful. I really loved it. I highly recommend it to all my fellow Canadians, but also to everyone else. Go read this book, and also give it to your kids if you have kids who are at least, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12, or a little younger if they are more advanced readers. But highly recommend this, 5 stars, and go check out the reading vlog if you want more detailed thoughts. Next up in August, I read a sapphic vampire story that was recommended to me a couple times in the comments of my Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil video. Some people recommended it as an alternative that I might enjoy more. Some people mentioned it as another book that disappointed them on the same level as Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, or disappointed them for similar reasons, or that they felt fell short for similar reasons. But I was very curious because it kept coming up in the comments, and I ended up enjoying this for the most part, more than Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, which is aligned with what some of you expected and not with what others are thinking. It's framed as a Carmilla retelling, and I think in some ways it certainly is heavily inspired by Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which I have also read. I don't know if framing this as a retelling is really the right way to market it, because it feels like a distinct story. I feel like it's trying to do a different thing. But we're following this 30-year-old woman who is married, but she and her husband have not been able to have children. And she has a bit of a complex, not necessarily particularly loving or healthy relationship with her husband. And they move to this new house, and on the way there, they run into this mysterious stranger who they allow to stay with them. And this woman is not really following the conventions of the time. She's very self-assured, she's very mysterious, and our protagonist Lenore starts feeling inextricably drawn to this mysterious woman. And things escalate from there, both in their relationship and also in the whole vampire aspect of this. And this was my third sapphic vampire read of the summer. I had Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil and Blood on Her Tongue, and then this one, Hungerstone. And I would say that my experience of this one was not dissimilar to Blood on Her Tongue. While I didn't find this one as atmospheric and creepy, I did really love the writing style. I thought it was beautifully written. It was very much up my alley in terms of the sort of lyrical, flowing prose. I also found Lenore to be a fascinating protagonist, quite complex and flawed, but also very magnetic for me as a reader. I was very drawn into her story, I suppose, is what I'm saying. I also found the mysterious house guest inspired by Carmilla to be also a very magnetic, charismatic, fascinating character. I wish we'd gotten more of her, but I do feel she was meant to maintain this sense of mystery, which also makes sense and is fair. This one wasn't as creepy and unsettling as Blood on Her Tongue for me, but definitely had a tense, mysterious atmosphere to it throughout, delivered on the vibes, I would say, and the writing style and the characters. I did feel kind of similar to Blood on Her Tongue, actually, that the protagonist had a little bit of a unnaturally rapid growth and change as a character right near the end. In this one, we got more time with the protagonist, I felt, and more of a gradual growth and change in the first 2/3 of the novel, but then things really escalate and things change very quickly, and I just wanted a little bit more focus on that time, because that was really the most interesting aspect of her character, was watching that transformation, and it happened very quickly, that you blink and you miss it sort of thing. I also really liked the development of her relationship with her mysterious house guest, but I also felt that they sort of had a very slow build, and there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of internal conflict and confusion on the part of Lenore, and then things sort of escalated very quickly, and then we kind of jumped over some of their relationship development in a way that, again, I felt like that would have been a really interesting growth and change and development to watch and to be a part of, and it just felt a little skimmed over. When I first read the ending, I was a little disappointed because I thought it was going to get way more over the top, extreme, intense, and it did not go the way I thought it would go. But the more I thought about it, the more I kind of enjoyed the ending for what it was and found it quite fitting for some of the themes that are being explored earlier on, and Lenore's experience of feeling very trapped in this life, trapped in her role in life as the well-bred wife of a wealthy man, the hostess, the one who always must be proper and endure whatever her husband requests of her, and to really fit what society wants her to do, to be proper and respectable and always on, basically. I loved that she got to sort of discover more of who she really was and chase what she really wanted out of life, and to try to find her own sense of freedom to exist in the world in a more authentic way to her. And I do think that the way the novel ended made sense for that character development and sort of tied back into what had happened before. But at the end of the day, I felt that this was maybe a touch simplistic thematically and not the most unique sapphic vampire story inspired by Carmilla that I've ever read necessarily, but I still found it enjoyable, and I liked the characters, and I thought the writing was really nice, and I thought the setting was quite vivid, and I had a good time while reading it. So for my rating, I think I'm landing around 3.5 stars, and for now I'm going to round that up to 4. I might change my mind and round it down to 3 instead. The difference between 3 and 4 stars in my mind is quite fast, and 3 stars can mean so many different things for me because it's right in the middle of the ratings. And for personal enjoyment reasons, I think I enjoyed this enough to give it 4 stars to round it up to that 4 stars, but it definitely wasn't as complex and thematically rich and sort of nuanced in those middle stages of the character and relationship development as I would have loved. Also could have had more horror, probably, for my personal taste. But I still had fun with it, nonetheless. So 4 stars for Hungerstone. Not necessarily the answer any of you were looking for when you asked me to read this one, but those are my thoughts. It is what it is. And then we have the final book that I finished in August, which was Lest Darkness Fall by L. Sprague de Camp. This was also for my Read It or Unhaul It challenge. So again, I will link the reading vlog down below. And I, again, give a more thorough review in my reading vlog, including a spoiler section if you want that. This is an out-of-print sci-fi novel from the 40s, novella. It's very short, in which our protagonist, Martin Padway, who is an archaeologist, is in Rome doing archaeology things, and then is sent back in time and is now in Rome shortly before the Gothic War and the fall of Rome, and feels that he must do everything within his power to prevent the fall of Rome. And that involves him inventing a bunch of things very early and getting heavily involved in politics. So it's quite a book. It's quite a ride. I enjoyed reading it. I had a lot of criticisms. I had a lot of nitpicks, which you can see in much detail in my Read It or Unhaul It video, but I had a good enough time with it. I enjoyed it. I found it interesting. Martin Padway, as I said in that other video, reminds me so much of Andy Weir's protagonists, of very much a self-insert competency porn kind of Gary Stu, which isn't my favorite ever, but he wasn't, totally off-putting or anything. He just was a genius who was good at everything, which does get a bit tiresome, but it was fun enough. It was entertaining enough. Like I said in that video, it's out of print, so it's hard to find, and I wouldn't say it's so amazing that it's worth jumping through hoops to get a copy. But if you do happen to run across it in a used bookstore, it might be fun to pick up and, be an enjoyable jaunt of a super short novella. But I gave Lest Darkness Fall 3 stars. And again, you can see my very detailed thoughts, including spoilers, in the Read It or Unhaul It challenge vlog, which I'll link down below in the description box. But with that, we have come to the end of this video. Those are all the books I finished in August. Like I said, a lighter month for me. Again, check out that Read It or Unhaul It challenge in which I read Lest Darkness Fall and The Marrow Thieves for an explanation as to why I didn't read as much in August. I'm not going to reiterate it here because I tried to say it quickly in that video and it went on too long anyway. And I know if I try to explain it again, it'll go on too long again. But it was still not a bad reading month considering I only read for around 2 weeks of it. I did have 2 5-star reads, which is awesome, and nothing under 3 stars, which is not too shabby. But with that, I'm gonna get going. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what your best and worst reads for August were and your thoughts on any of these books that you've picked up. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to head to squarespace.com for your free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. You can also use this QR code. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.